Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thank you all for being here. My name is Tal Howard, and I direct the Center for Faith and Inquiry, which hosts a lecture series and the honors program and conferences like this. And we're very glad to see that this day has finally arrived. We're glad to co-sponsor this with the History Department, and especially my colleague Jennifer Harper, who will be playing two roles today, doing some emceeing, but also a speaker in our conference. And I'm especially glad that so many of you made it from other parts of the country, from the West Coast, the Midwest, and elsewhere. Glad to welcome you here in New England. I wish I could say that every day like this was in New England, but we have to kind of deposit memories of days like this to help us make it through the long, snowy winters, especially this past winter was especially difficult. I grew up in the South, so especially difficult for me. But our topic today, just to make sure you're at the right conference, you're in the right classroom, is Islam in the Classroom: Challenges and Opportunities of Teaching about Islam in a Post-9/11 World. And our format, there are going to be 4 sessions of 1 hour. We've asked the presenters to keep their remarks to about 30 to 40 minutes to have a little Q&A. And then we will have a wrap-up panel discussion of all panelists at the end, punctuated by coffee breaks to keep us all motivated and awake. I should say maybe just a couple of logistic things. If you need the restrooms, they're just down the loggia here and to the left. If you are a registered guest, we will have box lunches at the lunch hour, or I guess lunch hour and a half. But this is an open conference. If you did not pre-register, the cafeteria, you just head to the chapel and turn right, and you'll find the cafeteria. But we hope to, whether in the lunch hour or the coffee breaks, you get to experience a little bit of the campus. The school actually owns quite a bit of land. There are trails into the woods. Don't get lost. Be back, but. We hope, glad to have such a nice day, such as today. I think the best way to introduce our topic is to read a passage from the grant application to the Lilly Fellows Program, which has generously helped us sponsor this conference. And we partnered with them before, and we're very glad for the work they do for church-related higher education throughout the nation, and they're seated at Valparaiso University. But the purpose of this one-day conference is to bring leading scholars together to deliberate well and wisely about how accurate and insightful knowledge of Islam can be taught in the college classroom. Particular emphasis will be placed on the teaching of Islam in church-affiliated colleges and universities, whether Protestant or Catholic. Possible foci of papers may include the place of Islam in the core curriculum, Christian-Muslim dialogue, the state of Islamic studies in North America, teaching the historical origins of Islam, teaching Islam and contemporary affairs, turning points in the history of Islam, understanding Islam in theological perspective, and teaching Western perceptions of Islam and Islamic perceptions of Western societies. So that's a lot of possible topics, but I just put that out there to give you some idea of the kind of the touchstone ideas that were in the grant application, and when we sent invitations to the speakers, they received this material as well. And actually, even though they'll be getting longer introductions before they speak, I was just going to ask the speakers, as I call your name, maybe you could just stand up and we can recognize you and thank you here at the beginning of the conference for the work you've put in. My colleague Jennifer Harper, who I've already mentioned, here at Gordon, Gabriel Reynolds at the University of Notre Dame, Judith Rood, professor of history and Middle Eastern studies at Biola University, and Amir Hussein, who is the professor of religious studies at Loyola University. And is Sandra Keating here yet? I think she's coming up from Providence College, and she's a specialist in Muslim and Christian relations, and she's going to moderate the panel discussion at the end of the day, but I think she's hit a little traffic coming through Boston, so she'll be showing up a little later. So anyway, it's a pleasure to have you here. I should say there are going to be students trickling in and out throughout the day, and I hope that's a learning experience for them as well. So now let me turn the lectern over to my colleague, Jennifer Hevelone Harper, to bring her own greeting and introduce our first speaker, Gabriel Reynolds.
Greetings. Welcome to Gordon College. And we are so grateful to the Lilly Endowment and to the Center for Faith and Inquiry for sponsoring this day. And I'm thankful to all of you, particularly those of you who traveled from long distances to be here. Teaching about Islam in the college classroom is an experience I think that many come to wishing for more resources. And so I feel like today we have assembled all these resources in this room, and I hope that we have good conversation and dialogue about your own experiences in doing this. I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Gabriel Reynolds is a professor of Islamic studies and theology at Notre Dame University. He holds degrees from Columbia University and Yale University. He focuses on the Quran and Muslim-Christian relationships in his research and has published several books, including The Emergence of Islam, The Quran and Its Biblical Subtext, and A Muslim Theologian in the Sectarian Milieu, Abd al-Jabbar and the Critique of Christian Origins. In addition to being a prolific writer, he has organized international conferences on the Quran at Notre Dame and given lectures throughout the Middle East, and is currently serving on the executive board of the International Quranic Studies Association, the first learned society dedicated to the study of the Quran. Today, he speaks to us on the Islamic challenge to Christian theology. Thank you, Gabriel.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. Thanks very much to Jennifer, first of all, but also to Tal Howard, and also to Gordon College generally for the invitation. I feel some pressure going first, but if I don't do a good job, then everyone who comes after me will look better. So I would try to keep that in perspective. Friends, I thought I would start actually with something of a confession that I feel not fully prepared to speak or well-trained to speak on this topic. And that's because my sense of speaking about teaching Islam at a church-affiliated university is that the first step is to have a good idea of what it means to be a church-affiliated university, to be a Christian institution of higher learning. And that's something I don't have in my personal background. I never went to a Christian or Catholic school. I grew up going to public schools and then went to a couple of secular schools for college and for my graduate training. But on the other hand, I've been teaching now for almost 13 years at the University of Notre Dame, which is an institution that prides itself at taking its Catholic affiliation seriously, not only on football, but also on this Catholic stuff. And this occurred to me when, during my first or second year teaching at Notre Dame, I went to another Catholic school, to Georgetown University, to give a talk. And after I gave my talk, I forget what it was on now, one of the first questions, someone raised his hand and said, "Well, how do you deal with teaching Islam at a place like Notre Dame? It's so Catholic." And that's when I realized that Notre Dame has a reputation for taking its Catholic identity seriously. And I have, in fact, therefore, over the past 12 and now in my 13th year teaching, begun to think about these questions. What does it mean to teach Islam in this context, in a Christian university or a Catholic university, in my case in particular? I've also had some time to think about a particular work, which is the idea of a university by Newman. And in this work, Newman defends the pursuit of knowledge and the right exercise of reason as activities which lead to the refinement of one's character and sharpens one's ability to grasp the revealed truths of faith. Newman writes, "Knowledge, the discipline by which it is gained, and the taste which it forms have a natural tendency to refine the mind." Later, after expressing some substantial and lengthy reservations about the potential ill effects of unbridled reason, Newman adds, "Under the shadow indeed of the church and in its due development, philosophy does service to the cause of morality. For Newman, knowledge or philosophy or reason is reliable only when it is exercised in conversation with the truths revealed by God." Now, Newman never considers the question which is before us today, which is how to teach non-Christian religions in the context of a Christian university. But presumably he would argue that this topic too, like the pursuit of any other sort of knowledge, should be done in the light of Christian truths. But what is the proper way to study a non-Christian religion in a Christian institution? And in particular, what is to be done with the case of Islam, a religion which seems to present a special challenge to the faith of Christians? Now, any religion presents a certain challenge to Christian faith, inasmuch as all religions provide alternative claims regarding the divine and divine revelation. But Islam is a special case. Islam not only provides alternative claims to Christianity, it also claims that Christianity is wrong in its fundamental theological doctrines. Wrong about the Bible, wrong about Jesus, wrong about God. Put otherwise, other religions claim alternative ideas about revelation, but they do not challenge Christian ideas in a particular way. Islam does both. On several occasions, for example, the Quran challenges the doctrine of Christ's divinity. So we see, for example, in Quran chapter 5, the Quran is a book about 2/3 the size of the New Testament, with 114 chapters or surahs. Here we have two quotations from the 5th surah, known as Al-Ma'idah in the Quran, or the table. Quran chapter 5, verse 72, they are certainly faithless who say, Allah is the Messiah, son of Mary. Isn't that interesting? It doesn't quote the Christians saying that Christ is God or the Messiah is God. It quotes them saying things the other way around, that God is Christ or Allah is the Messiah. But the Messiah had said, O children of Israel, worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord. Again, verse 116 of the same chapter. Here we have a fascinating passage which seems to be something like a conversation between God and Jesus. The Quran doesn't tell us exactly where or when this conversation took place, but nevertheless, it quotes God posing a question to Jesus, challenging Jesus. And when Allah will say, O Jesus, son of Mary, was it you who said to the people, take me and my mother for gods besides Allah? He will say, Subhanaka, immaculate are you. It does not behoove me to say what I have no right to say. It is noteworthy that in these two passages, the Quran has Jesus himself deny his own divinity. The Quran makes Jesus a spokesman for the Islamic critique of Christianity. As Tarif Khalidi has pointed out, this takes place only with Jesus in the Quran. Moses, for example, is never made to speak against the Jews. This seems to reflect something of the historical context of Islam's emergence, namely that the community in which the Quran was preached was engaged in debates over Jesus' nature. I hope that makes sense. There's not simply a statement about Christ in the third person. There's a quotation of Christ himself reprimanding Christians for the things that they've said about him. The Quran and the Hadith are a collection of sayings or traditions about the Prophet Muhammad, either things he said or reports by eyewitnesses of things he did, sometimes reports of things he didn't do. The Quran and Hadith also challenge other Christian beliefs, including the Trinity, the crucifixion. There's a famous verse in the 4th chapter, or Al-Nisa of the Quran, which seems to deny the crucifixion. Whether it actually does so is an interesting question. But also the authority or authenticity of the Bible. For example, a Hadith states, this is not attributed to something Muhammad himself said, but rather another companion of the Prophet, or a companion of the Prophet known as Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas said, O Muslims, how do you ask the people of the scriptures, that is Jews and Christians, though your book, which was revealed to his prophet, is the most recent information from Allah, and you recite it. The book that has not been distorted, which implies that the other books have been distorted, that the Bible is unreliable, but the Quran is reliable. The Hadith also include many reports that the Prophet Muhammad cursed Jews. This is starting very negative, but it's going to get positive, I promise. The Hadith also include reports that the Prophet Muhammad cursed Jews and Christians on his deathbed for the way they turned the tombs of prophets into shrines. For example, this tradition found in the most famous or most canonical collection of Hadith, these reports of sayings or deeds of the Prophet, and this is the collection by Bukhari, reports, when the last moment of the life of Allah's apostle, that is the messenger of God, Muhammad, came, he started putting his shirt on his face, and when he felt hot and short of breath, he took it off his face and said, May Allah curse the Jews and the Christians, for they built the places of worship at the graves of their prophets. The prophet was warning Muslims of what those, the Jews and Christians, had done. How are Christians then to approach Islam in light of such challenges? Now, there is more than one answer to this question. In fact, this morning I'd like to present 3 possible answers to a proper Christian response. The first of these is apologetics, or the defense of the faith. The second of these I'll call the quest for commonality, and the third is the admiration of the other. Now, these approaches are not mutually exclusive. One or two or all 3 of them can be combined in a classroom setting. But let's begin with the first, defense of the faith. Now, the first approach, defense of the faith or apologetics, has a bad name in some academic circles. To some, it involves a limited or contrived use of reason, a parochial worldview, or even a certain dogmatic exclusivism in soteriological terms when it comes to questions of who is saved, who gets to heaven. Nevertheless, apologetics, considered simply as a rational defense of the faith, is a standard subfield of systematic theology, and it need not involve polemics or proselytism. The point of apologetics is precisely to be reasonable when speaking about one's faith. This much is expressed in the locus classicus for Christian apologetics, namely the counsel of the first letter of Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. Simply proclaim the Lord Christ wholly in your hearts, and always have your answer ready for people who ask you the reason for the hope that you have. Yet if apologetics is about giving the reasons for the faith in their hearts, it is also about responding to particular challenges to faith. Indeed, apologetical works are by their nature responses, answers to challenges, hence the title of the talk this morning. Now, as we've already seen, the fundamental sources of Islam, the Quran and the Hadith, contain numerous challenges to Christian faith. Moreover, inspired by these challenges, Christians have, in fact, throughout the centuries, composed responses to Muslim challenges. One thinks of the monumental work responding to the Muslim polemic of Abu Isa al-Waraq on the Incarnation in the Trinity. This is a work by the Christian Jacobite Yahya ibn Adi. Many other Muslim works speak not of the Trinity and the Incarnation, but rather of other elements of Christian faith, including the Bible. One thinks of the famous polemic attributed, probably falsely, to the great Muslim thinker al-Ghazali, entitled Ar-Radd al-Jamil, in which al-Ghazali seeks to prove on the basis of the Christian scripture that it affirms Islamic and not Christian truths about Christ. Indeed, Christians have a long history then of responding to such treatises. Some of these can turn, however, into anti-Islamic polemics. And when they turn into polemical works, it is my suggestion, their apologetical nature disappears altogether. They become something closer to ill-spirited sophistry. And let me give one example of ill-spirited sophistry. This is the case with the inauspiciously titled work, Unveiling Islam, of the Muslim background Christians Ergun and Amit Channer. In the introduction of the work, they write, "Please do not assume this is a diatribe filled with invective against a world religion." But what we find in most of the work is a diatribe filled with invective against a world religion. The God of Islam, as the Channers tell it, is not the God of Christianity. Instead, he is a distant one, a cold judge, a hater. The Prophet of Islam is a militant messenger. They conclude, in a world searching, this is a quotation, in a world searching for peace, following the life of this warrior brings about bloodshed. Such statements must seem surprising, to say the least, to the millions of Muslim Americans for whom following Muhammad brings about instead peaceful and loving relationships with non-Muslims. Works such as that of the Chainers are counterproductive to instructors interested in a serious theological reflection on Islam and Christianity. On the other hand, there are other sorts of Christian apologetical works which can and should have a place in a Christian university. In my course, Islam and Christian Theology at Notre Dame, I read a work with students of Thomas Aquinas entitled De Rationibus Fidei, on the reasons for the faith. De Rationibus Fidei was written sometime in the 1260s after Aquinas had completed his Summa contra Gentiles in 1264. It was prompted by a dispute which took place in Crusader-held Antioch between an unknown anonymous Muslim and someone who's labeled only as the cantor of the Dominican church in that city. And during the course of this dispute, the unknown Muslim conversation partner posed 5 different challenges to the Christian. Namely, the Christian claims that Christ is a son of God, that there are 3 persons in God, that Christ was crucified for the salvation of the human race, that's 3, that Christians, as he puts it, eat their God on the altar. The Muslim says, even if the body of Christ were as big as a mountain, it should have already been consumed. And the 4th challenge is that humans have free will. The cantor, this unknown Dominican in the city of Antioch in the 1260, evidently troubled by these replies, wrote to Thomas in search of help answering them. And this treatise, De Rationibus Fidei, is his reply. Now, the remarkable thing about Thomas's reply is that, with the exception of one small remark where he says that Muslims think of the Christian conception of the Trinity in a carnal way, namely that Mary had relations with God to produce Jesus, he says they think of it that way because they themselves are carnal. So that's the one sort of polemical note in the treatise. But through the rest of the treatise, he does not attack the views of Muslims. Now, part of this is because, as Thomas himself admits in the Summa contra Gentiles, he knew very little about Islam. But most of this is because what he seeks to do in this treatise is to present a reasonable presentation of Christian doctrines. For example, he recommends to his Dominican confrere that he present the Trinity not with a metaphorical language of Father and Son and Spirit, but instead with a metaphor of the intellect. Just as a painter thinks of a thing he wishes to paint in his mind before he paints, and in so doing produces an image, for example, of a tree or a table, thus God, who is constantly thinking and constantly thinking perfectly, produces an eternal image, or better, an eternal word. And once this word is produced, there's necessarily a relation of the appetite between the thinker and the thought, some sort of relation measured by love. And since God has perfect love, that relationship means a sort of identity between the thinker and the thought. Thus we have the intellect, the thought produced by the intellect, and the love between the thought and the intellect as a metaphor for the Christian Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. One further example of the way Thomas presents Christian truths. He explains the incarnation with a metaphor of a builder who desires to repair a building which has fallen into disrepair. It makes sense, he insists, that the Son of God would come into the world for this repair job, since the world was originally created through the Son. And it is a rule that principles which make something are also the rules for repairing it. If a house falls down, it is restored according to the plan by which it was first made. Thomas continues, explaining that the element of creation that was in disrepair was man's rational nature, a perversity of the will. And, he continues, there was no better means by which the Son of God could fix man's rational nature than to assume himself a human nature. This is a quotation now from Thomas. To excite our love towards God, there was no more powerful way than that the Word of God, through whom all things were made, should assume our human nature in order to restore it, so that he would be both God and man. First of all, because the strongest way God could show how much he loves man was his willing to become man for his salvation. And here's a beautiful line at the end. Nothing can provoke love more than to know that one is loved. The experience of reading Thomas Aquinas' De Rationibus Fidei tends to be a positive one for my students. It does not involve a polemic against Islam, but it shows how reflection on Islam can lead to a profound and detailed reflection on Christian faith. Other texts that I read in a similar way or with similar goals include those by the Protestant theologians David Marshall, who's written a small treatise entitled Learning from How Muslims See Christianity, and 2 other Protestant thinkers, Colin Chapman and Kenneth Craig. Yet the counter with Islam challenges us not only to reflect more profoundly on Christian mysteries, but also to seek out shared values with Islam in an effort to promote harmony between the 2 religions. Interreligious dialogue, this effort to promote harmony, is usually marked by what I've called a quest for commonality, a searching out of things which are held in common between Islam and Christianity. This sort of quest for commonality usually involves a bracketing of the question of whether Islam, which comes after Christianity, supersedes Christianity, and an examination of the two religious systems in the abstract. A good example of this quest for commonality is the famous letter entitled A Common Word, published on October 13th, 2007, and signed by 138 Muslim scholars. This is just a screenshot that I took of the website from A Common Word. And in addition, a Christian response, which was written by a number of Protestant and Catholic Christian theologians, mostly American. A Common Word, the title of which comes from Quran chapter 3, verse 64, the proper translation of which is an interesting question, and which I'll get back to, this treatise is shaped around the principle that both Islam and Christianity consider love of God and love of neighbor as the central principles of religious faith. The letter opens as follows. Muslims and Christians together make up well over half of the world's population. Without peace and justice between them, there can be no meaningful peace in the world, etc. The basis for this peace and understanding already exists. The very foundational principles of both faith, love of the one God and love of neighbor. It's interesting, and I've put here in blue, unity of God, because the way that the text adds here unity of God points to a certain tension around the topic of what, in fact, is the foundational principle of the faith of Islam. It is interesting, indeed, that this unity of God, this phrase is added here. And the text, in fact, continues by testifying to the importance of the unity of God in the Quran by quoting Quran chapter 112, verses 1 to 2, in the very next paragraph of the treatise. Of God's unity, God says in the Holy Quran, say He is God the One, God the self-sufficient, sought of all. That's a funny translation for one single Arabic word. This is also sort of King Jamesian English. This is a translation of Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall. Incidentally, it's interesting that the text omits the second half of this surah, which speaks of God not begetting or being begotten, which seems to be directed at Christianity. Some people might dispute that. In any case, the text then quotes Quran chapter 73, there's the rest of the verse, chapter 73, verse 8, as a witness to the importance of loving God. So invoke the name of thy Lord and devote thyself to Him with a complete devotion. Interestingly, the word love itself is not here, but instead tabtil, the Arabic word is tabtil, meaning to be devoted to God exclusively, or even to separate oneself from worldly things. Regarding love of neighbor, a common word quotes a hadith according to which Muhammad said, as preserved by the same collector, Bukhari, none of you has faith until you love for your neighbor what you love for yourself. For a biblical witness, a common word turns to Mark 12. There's a parallel passage in Matthew 22, which has Jesus refer to Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19, which is the famous Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. This is the first commandment, and the second like it is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. This is an understandable but interesting decision, that is, that the authors of this letter choose to quote Jesus quoting the Torah on love. It is an omission, perhaps, that they do not quote one of the better-known passages on love in the New Testament from 1 John, which speaks of God as love. Indeed, tellingly, the letter never quotes the New Testament outside of the Gospels. It does refer to Paul in one note, but otherwise it only quotes the Gospels, and it only quotes the Synoptic Gospels. It never quotes the Gospel of John. But let's not lose track of this point of divine unity. That's really what I wanted to emphasize here. In this, because I want to show one of the complications or difficulties of this quest for commonality, this approach to Islam and Christianity by seeking parallels. A common word subsequently quotes the verse which the title of the treatise comes from. O people of the Scripture, come to a common, if that's the right word, sawa, word between us and you, that we shall worship none but God, and that we shall ascribe no partner unto Him, and that none of us shall take others for lords besides God. This verse, like so much of the Quran, puts the emphasis neither on the love of God nor the love of neighbor, but rather on the recognition of divine unity. In this regard, it is perhaps worth mentioning that this word sawa, it could mean, instead of common, the straight or the just or the correct word. One might compare the Quran's use of a similar expression, sirat as-sawi, meaning the smooth or direct path, which seems to be parallel to sirat al-mustaqim. Now, about divine unity in the Quran, in two different places in Surah 4, chapter 4, the Quran insists that the only sin which God will not forgive is to associate something with God. God will not forgive that anything shall be associated with him, but other than that, he forgives what he wills. The spirit of this principle is reflected in the famous hadith, where the Prophet is made to say, I have been ordered by God to fight against people until they say, La ilaha illallah. There is no God but God. And whoever said, La ilaha illallah, has saved his life and property from me. Quran chapter 3, verse 64 might then be read in a different way, which is not inviting towards a common word as much as advancing the particular Islamic perspective on divine unity. Indeed, it's possible that it is meant principally as a critique of Christian doctrine. Incidentally, these are the terms which the authors of the letter Common Word say must be the central point of Muslim-Christian conversations. They say at one point, let this common ground be the basis of all future interfaith dialogue between us. And it's understandable why they would say that. For Muslims, the Quran comes from God. It's the word of God brought down from heaven to earth. And therefore, it's the appropriate place to begin with dialogue. I remember I was in Lebanon once traveling with the sheikh who was teaching me Quran at the time. And he was very interested in converting me to Islam and kept on making arguments. And after a while I said, this is getting tiring. This is too much of this proselytizing. And he said, I don't mean it in a bad way, but God has called me to invite you in a good way to Islam. There's another Quran verse he was invoking there, but you can see the impact of the Quran on this perspective. The letter ends with a curiously worded appeal to Christians to remember Jesus' words in the gospel, namely the Shema. And in a sense, the common word illustrates to us just how complicated the quest for commonality can be. Whereas the Quran seems to put the emphasis on divine unity, in seeking out common ground with Christians, the authors of the letter still try to phrase love of God as the central principle in the Quran. I'm not denying that it's an important principle in the Quran, but the question of divine unity in the Quran, which invokes a critique for Christianity, is also central. In a classroom setting, this text might be used along with a Christian response to a common word, which was authored by Harold Attridge, Miroslav Volf, Joseph Cumming, and Emily Towns from Yale University, just the following month in November 2007. In some ways, this Christian letter seeks to challenge subtly the perspective of a common word. Whereas a common word speaks of love of God and love of neighbor, the Christian response insists, in this case following 1 John, that God is love and that his love extends to all, quoting Matthew 5, verse 45, that God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good. This is interesting since, although the authors of the Christian letter don't say exclusively, the Quran speaks on several occasions of the sort of people that God does not love, such as unbelievers or wrongdoers, whereas the Christian letter argues that one must go beyond love of neighbor, even to love of enemies. As both Christian and Muslim letters make clear, the effort at rapprochement between Islam and Christianity is fraught with complications. It usually involves a judicious selection of scriptural citations from the Bible, the Quran, and the Hadith, meant to make Christianity and Islam seem as similar as possible. But in some ways, Christianity and Islam are very different. Therefore, this quest for commonality can at times seem contrived. Fortunately, there's a third way to thinking about the challenge of Islam in a Christian university, a way which avoids apologetics and which avoids the contrived, if not forced, interpretations by those committed to rapprochement between Islam and Christianity. This third way, and I'm moving towards a conclusion here, so you can be assured of that. This third way, which I've called an admiration for the other, involves fostering an appreciation for Islam as a cohesive, coherent, logical, comprehensible religious system which has engendered great piety in millions of believers. The key word in this description is system. The first step to fostering religious admiration for Islam is to recognize that Islam functions, like Christianity, as a religious system with its own logic, its own sources, and its own doctrines. The point is to accept that Islam is different from Christianity, and indeed that Islam, even if it claims to complete and correct Christianity, has in certain ways an analogous religious system. This sort of approach to Islam should lead a Christian to declare something like, instead of declaring, oh, Islam and Christianity are so similar, look at our common doctrines, instead to say, now I see how Islam works and why Muslims believe what they believe and do what they do. It is different from my faith and it challenges my faith, yet it is nevertheless coherent and admirable. In some ways, this approach to Islam is the very opposite of the quest for commonality. Instead of emphasizing similarities, one emphasizes difference. Maybe an analogy is helpful here. I see this as something like the case of scientists who have two different models to explain the same phenomenon. For example, and this will be risky because I'm terrible at science, but I think some might explain the way particles move according to Newtonian physics, where things revolve around one another and are attracted or repelled. But others might explain the way particles move according to string theory, I think, where vibrations of tiny strings explain the motions of larger particles. Now, the Newtonian camp, if they even exist anymore, I'm not sure about that, might learn about string theory and see how that theory fits together and understand why people believe in it, even if they still choose to believe in their own system, their own method of explaining reality. The opposite, of course, would also be true. It is for this reason that in my undergraduate class on Islam and Christian theology, we do not simply read the works of Muslims who have beliefs or spiritual practices that might seem close to the piety of 21st century American Catholic youth. That is, I could simply read authors who present Islam in a way that seems less foreign to them. We could focus on Sufism, a tradition of Islam which has an emphasis on the spiritual path, and even in some ways has certain authority which is analogous to Catholicism. We could focus on Shiism, which has ideas of sacrifice in the traditions around the figure of Hussein. Also around the figures of Zainab, there's a tradition around the sorrows of Zainab, which is not unlike the traditions around the sorrows of Mary. But I don't do this. Actually, I do that, but it's not all I do. Much of what I do is to introduce young 21st century American Catholics to Sharia-minded Islam, the sort of Islam which, incidentally, is on the rise in so many places in the world today, while Sufism, at least Sufism, is declining in many places, and Shiism is struggling with sort of Salafi Islam in many places. In order to accomplish this, we spend a good amount of time reading fatwas from conservative muftis, such as the Saudi al-Munajjid on his website, Islam QA. For example, here's another screenshot from this website. I usually take them through a fatwa on sneezing. I avoid, as a rule, topics which are the standard materials of debates over Islam. Instead, I look to simpler topics which show them how a Sharia-minded Muslim thinks without having my students make mental links with either anti-Islamic polemic or Islamic apologetics or da'wah. Hence the sneezing. When asked about proper etiquette after sneezing, al-Munajjid has the following to say. It was proven in the hadith, you remember hadith by now, these sayings of the Prophet, that the Prophet said, God, Allah, likes the act of sneezing and dislikes the act of yawning. So if any one of you sneezes and praises Allah, it is a duty on every Muslim who hears him to say, Yarhamuk Allah, may God have mercy on you. As for yawning, it is from the shaitan, so if any of you feels the urge to yawn, he should suppress it as much as he can. For when any of you yawns, the shaitan or Satan laughs at him. He goes on to explain that for medical reasons, also sneezing is a positive experience. It brings the blessing of relief by vapors and gives some rational explanations for why sneezing should be good, why you should praise God after you sneeze. And then finally he says, it is also important to know that the Muslim should submit to the text and act in accordance with them without trying too hard to understand precisely why a text commands or forbids something. At first glance, this sort of discussion strikes most of my students as unusual. The first reaction is usually to ask, from a Christian perspective, why would God care about sneezing or yawning? But these sorts of questions present a perfect opportunity to think more carefully about the meaning of piety in Islam. The best answer to these questions, of course, is that from the perspective of a Sharia-minded Muslim, God cares about everything. The Sharia is universal. It is the totality of God's will for every human action. God desires humans to be obedient to Him in everything, not only in things such as prayer or fasting or almsgiving that a Christian might consider religious. All things are religious. Indeed, why would God, the Creator, care only about certain aspects of human life, but not others? Indeed, Muslims have not infrequently criticized Christians as an incomplete, or Christianity, as an incomplete religious system. It might have some nice spiritual or moral teachings, but has very little to say about most aspects of life, from dress to food, to war and peace, to all aspects of life, including sneezing. It is true that Americans say sometimes, not always, maybe not enough, God bless you when someone sneezes, but this is a mere cultural habit. Germans say Gesundheit, and French say à tes souhaits, to your wishes. I remember there's an episode of Seinfeld. Maybe the students don't remember Seinfeld. But there's an episode of Seinfeld in which Jerry says, why do we say God bless you? It would make people feel a lot better if when they sneeze, someone told them, you are so good looking. Anyway, from this point of view, Islam is the complete religion by caring about all aspects of human life. It's the perfect religion, ad-din al-kamil. Now, the interesting thing is that most pious Christians, this is my last page here, so you're almost done with me. Now, the interesting thing is that most pious Christians can identify with the idea of giving one's entire life, and not only one's spiritual life, to God. Indeed, Christians aspire to sainthood, to pray unceasingly, to live out the Beatitudes, to love all people. From this perspective, pious Muslims should be able to develop an authentic appreciation for the religiosity of Muslims who say praise be to God when they sneeze in an effort to be obedient to Him. But wait, there's more. Towards the end of the fatwa, we find this passage. I've read the first sentence of it. Here, Munajjid explains that Muslims should submit themselves to the texts even when they don't fully understand those texts, because they have trust in God, who does not, here's the end of the citation, who does not prescribe anything for His slaves or servants unless it is in their best interest, and God knows best. This is interesting. On the one hand, Munajjid, the author of this fatwa or juridical opinion, seeks to make God's command understandable. At one point he even says there's medical reasons why sneezing is good. But on the other hand, he insists that even if one is not convinced by his efforts to make it understandable, it is still important to obey this command. Why? Because it has been revealed by God in a trustworthy hadith. All of this is remarkably close to the Christian idea of mystery. Christians seek to understand God, and they will go on doing so, which is good for me because I teach in a theology department. They seek to prove how it is possible that God could be both just and merciful, or how God could be incarnate, or how God could be three in one, or how the death of God could be a sacrifice which pays the price for sins, or how God could be present under the form of bread and wine in the Eucharist. Christians seek to understand and to explain all these things, even as they confess that they will never do so. This is a Christian sense of mystery. And what is more, Christians nevertheless insist that it is right to believe in these things, not because they have been proven to be true, but because they've been revealed by God and passed down by people, the apostles, whom we can trust because they went to their death testifying these things. The point in my class is that Christians who are ready to accept divine mysteries must be ready to appreciate Islamic beliefs or Islamic mysteries, whether that concerns sneezing or, more importantly, perhaps, halal food, approaches to alcohol, the wearing of the hijab or the headscarf, rules on marriage and divorce, regulations on how and when and what direction one should pray, and how one washes or does ablutions before prayer. Now, a Christian need not become a Muslim to appreciate any of these things, and he or she can go on saying, God bless you, instead of Yarhamuk Allah, or may God have mercy on you. However, by fully embracing and appreciating the Christian faith and recognizing the place of mystery therein, Christians should be led to appreciate the faith of Muslims. Indeed, I would suggest that Christians have not only an ability, but also the obligation to do so. Thank you.